History is a story told by the victors. But what of the other side? What was it like to be inside the most terrifying military machine ever assembled, to witness the euphoria of impossible victories and the numbing horror of a collapse just as total? This is the story of the Second World War as seen from the inside, from the German perspective. Our story begins not with a bang, but with the whisper of humiliation. January 1933, Adolf Hitler is Chancellor. Germany is a broken nation, crushed by the Great War, enchained by the Treaty of Versailles. Its army is a shadow, 100,000 men, no tanks, no air force, no pride. The victors of 1918 believed they had neutered Germany forever. They were wrong. From the moment Hitler took power, a secret pulse began to beat. The rise of the regime wasn't just a political change, it was, in secret, a declaration of intent. While the world saw public works programs and new highways, they were blind to the true purpose. These projects weren't just for cars, they were for tanks. Discreetly, military planning was disguised. Clandestine rearmament, which had trickled under the previous republic, now became a flood. In defiance of Versailles, factories began to tool up. Fictitious companies were created to finance weapons. Pilots were trained in secret, sometimes in, of all places, the Soviet Union. It was a national conspiracy, a shared secret that the shame of 1918 would be avenged. Then in 1935, the mask came off. Hitler announced compulsory military service. The Reichswehr was reborn as the Wehrmacht. The world watched, nervous, but did nothing. They chose appeasement, and with every concession, the machine grew stronger, bolder. But this wouldn't be the army of the last war. A new radical doctrine was being whispered in the officer corps. It was a theory that dismissed the static horror of trench warfare. It was a theory built on a terrifying synthesis: the speed of the tank, the terror of the dive bomber, and the shock of a single, decisive breakthrough. It didn't have a formal name yet, but its essence was simple: lightning. And it was about to be unleashed. By the summer of 1939, the German High Command was no longer discussing if they would attack Poland, but when. The 1.5 million men massed on the border were not there for a border dispute. They were there to test a theory. But an invasion needs a pretext. On the night of August 31st, a lie was crafted. German SS troopers, dressed in Polish uniforms, staged a Polish attack on a German radio station at Gleiwitz. It was crude, clumsy, and utterly unbelievable, but it was the only excuse the machine needed. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939, the world changed. It wasn't a war, the propaganda claimed, but a counteroffensive. The first shots were fired by the battleship Schleswig-Holstein against a Polish fort. But the real attack came from the air and the land. The Luftwaffe struck airfields and command centers, shattering the Polish Air Force before it ever got off the ground. And then, the panzers. For the first time, tanks were not used as infantry support. They were used as a spearhead. Concentrated into divisions, they punched a hole in the Polish lines and raced for the interior, followed by motorized infantry. The Polish army, though brave, was built for a 1918-style war. They were overwhelmed. This was the first taste of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was brutal, fast, and devastating. The world was stunned. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war. German generals, terrified of a two-front war, looked west with dread. But nothing happened. The French army, supposedly the most powerful in the world, sat behind its impenetrable Maginot Line. This strange, quiet period became known as the Sitzkrieg, or phony war. This inaction was a critical signal to Berlin. The West was afraid. This fatal perception would fuel a hubris that would eventually consume everyone. Within weeks, Poland was crushed, carved up between Germany and its strange new ally, the Soviet Union.
The Wehrmacht had proven its theory, and now its eyes turned west.
After the phony war, the world expected a repeat of World War I. They expected a bloody, static clash against the Maginot Line, France's billion-dollar invincible fortress. The German High Command knew a direct assault was suicide, so they settled on one of the most audacious gambles in military history. The plan was simple: do the impossible. While one army group made a noisy diversionary attack on Belgium and the Netherlands, the real blow would come from somewhere else: the Ardennes, a dense, hilly forest considered impassable for tanks. The Allies hadn't bothered to guard it. In May 1940, the Panzers did the impossible. A traffic jam of steel, miles long, wound its way through the forest. When they burst out on the other side, the Allied front collapsed. The German spearhead didn't drive at the enemy, it drove past them. They raced for the English Channel, cutting off the entire British expeditionary force and the best French armies. The speed was dizzying. German soldiers, fueled by adrenaline and, in many cases, pervitin, a methamphetamine, barely slept. In Germany, the news was ecstatic. This wasn't just a victory, it was revenge for 1918. Then came a moment that is still debated. The Panzers were just miles from the beaches of Dunkirk, where the British army was trapped, its back to the sea. A final push could have annihilated them. And then, the halt order came. Was it Hitler's arrogance? Was it Goering's plea to let his Luftwaffe finish the job? Or was it a moment of confusion? Whatever the reason, the Panzers stopped. This pause, this seemingly minor decision, allowed over 300,000 Allied soldiers to escape. It was a mistake of historic proportions, one that would plant the seeds of a disaster 4 years later. But at the time, it barely registered. Paris fell. France surrendered. In less than 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht had done what their fathers had failed to do in 4 years. Hitler toured Paris. The German soldier seemed invincible. From the German perspective, the war was already won. Only one stubborn obstacle remained. In the summer of 1940, Germany stood as the master of Europe. The Wehrmacht, undefeated, prepared for its final conquest, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Great Britain. But the German High Command knew a simple truth. You cannot invade an island if you do not control the sea. And you cannot control the sea if you do not first control the air. The invasion of Britain would have to be preceded by the destruction of the Royal Air Force. This task fell to Hermann Goering and his Luftwaffe, the symbol of new German power. They were confident. They had crushed every air force they had met. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940, and at first, the German plan was methodical. They bombed radar stations, airfields, and command centers. It was a brutal, grinding battle fought by young men in the skies over Kent and Sussex. The German pilots were skilled, battle-hardened, and flew excellent planes like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. But they had a critical weakness: fuel. Flying from bases in France, they could only stay over London for a few precious minutes before their bingo fuel warning forced them to turn back, often leaving their bombers unprotected. Meanwhile, the British were fighting over their own homes. They had a new secret weapon, the Dowding system, an intricate web of radar and observers that allowed them to see the German raids coming and scrambled just enough fighters to meet them. Frustrated by the RAF's refusal to break, the German strategy shifted. In September, a few German bombers, off course, accidentally bombed London. The British retaliated by bombing Berlin. The raid did little damage, but it was a deep personal insult to Hitler and Goering. In a fit of rage, they changed the objective. No longer would the Luftwaffe target the airfields, they would now target the cities. They would break the will of the British people. This was the Blitz, and it was the single greatest mistake of the battle. By bombing London, Goering gave the battered RAF airfields a desperate, gasping breath. They could repair, rearm, and rest. The Luftwaffe found that its bombers were slow, vulnerable, and unable to defend themselves against the British Spitfires and Hurricanes. The losses were catastrophic. By late 1940, it was clear. The RAF was not broken. The skies could not be won. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. This was the first time the German war machine had stalled. It was the first failure, and it would force Hitler to make a monstrous, fateful pivot away from the West and towards the vast, frozen, and terrible East.
The failure over Britain left Hitler impatient. While he still believed England would fall, he was now consumed by his true ideological obsession: the Soviet Union. The 1939 Non-Aggression Pact between Hitler and Stalin had shocked the world, but for Hitler it was never more than a temporary convenience. In his mind, the East was Germany's living space, or Lebensraum. It was a land of subhuman Slavs and Jewish Bolshevik ideologues. It had to be conquered, cleansed, and colonized. In December 1940, even as the Blitz raged, he signed Directive 21, Operation Barbarossa. It was to be the largest, most brutal invasion in human history. The plan was built on the same hubris that had conquered France. It would be a Blitzkrieg on an impossible scale. 3 massive army groups, North, Center, and South, would attack along a 3,000-kilometer front. They would encircle and destroy the Red Army in a matter of weeks before the dreaded Russian winter could set in. The German High Command was convinced the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay. Kick in the door, they said, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. On June 22, 1941, the gamble began. Over 3 million German soldiers, along with allies, crossed the border. Stalin, who had received hundreds of warnings, refused to believe them. The surprise was total. In the first hours, the Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground. The Wehrmacht's advance was breathtaking. The Panzer sliced through the disorganized Soviet lines, creating enormous pockets of encircled troops. At Minsk, 300,000 Soviet soldiers were captured. At Kiev, it was over 600,000. The newsreels back home showed endless columns of surrendering men, a tide of victory that seemed unstoppable. German propaganda declared the war in the East all but won, but beneath the surface of this stunning success, the seeds of doom were being sown. The sheer size of Russia was the first enemy. The Panzers were outrunning their supply lines, which stretched for miles over primitive, dusty roads. The Red Army, though battered, was not breaking. It was trading space for time, retreating and scorching the earth as it went. And then the first rains came. The dust turned to a thick, bottomless mud, the Rasputitsa, which stopped the German tanks and trucks in their tracks. The short war was getting longer, and the one enemy the Germans truly feared was just around the corner. The German soldier, the Lancer, who crossed into the Soviet Union in 1941, felt like a conqueror. He was the product of the Hitler Youth, fed a diet of propaganda that told him he was a racially superior warrior liberating a primitive land. The letters he sent home in those first weeks were full of confidence. That confidence did not last. The reality of the Eastern Front was not a heroic poster. It was lice, dysentery, and a mud that never dried. It was the dawning, terrifying realization that the enemy was not the disorganized rabble they'd been promised. Worse, this was not a war like the one in France, which had been, for most part, a conventional war. This was an ideological war, a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. Special SS units, the Einsatzgruppen, followed behind the army with a single, horrific task: to murder communists, intellectuals, and above all, Jews. The average German soldier was now implicated in a level of brutality that defied imagination. He was ordered to live off the land, which meant stealing food from a population already on the verge of starvation. He saw partisans or suspected partisans hanged in public squares. This brutal occupation only hardened Soviet resistance. The German soldier was now fighting an enemy who knew that surrender was not an option. And then the cold came. In November 1941, the temperature plummeted. The Wehrmacht, still in its summer uniforms, was utterly unprepared.
Hitler, in his arrogance, had assumed victory would come before winter. He had not bothered to issue winter clothing. Guns jammed, the oil and tank engines froze solid. Frostbite claimed more casualties than combat. Soldiers cut blankets into strips to wrap their feet, their boots frozen to their skin. They slept in frozen holes in the ground, listening to the howl of the wind and the distant cries of the wolves or of wounded men they couldn't reach. The advance ground to a halt just outside the gates of Moscow. German reconnaissance troops could see the spires of the Kremlin, but they could not go any further. The machine was frozen. And in that moment, the Red Army, which they believed was dead, did the unthinkable. It counterattacked. A fresh, new army, Siberian troops equipped for the cold, slammed into the exhausted, frozen German lines. The Blitzkrieg was over. The long, agonizing war of attrition had just begun.
The failure at Moscow in 1941 was a shock, but not a fatal one. By the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht had stabilized. Hitler, now micromanaging the war, had a new obsession. He believed the key to victory lay in the south, the rich oil fields of the Caucasus. The offensive, Case Blue, began. The German Sixth Army, under General Paulus, was to advance to the city of Stalingrad. Its mission was simple: capture the city, secure the flank, and allow the panzers to push south for the oil. Stalingrad itself was not the main objective, at first, but the city bore Stalin's name, and for Hitler, that made it a matter of personal pride. He diverted more and more forces to the city. Stalin, just as stubborn, ordered the city held at all costs. "Not one step back," he commanded. The Battle of Stalingrad became a new kind of hell. It was Rottenkrieg, rat war, a war fought not for miles, but for inches, for sewers, for factory basements, for the rubble of a single apartment building. The Luftwaffe had bombed the city into a skeleton, but in doing so had created the perfect defensive terrain. Every pile of rubble was a machine gun nest. German soldiers, trained for rapid, mobile warfare, were now forced into desperate hand-to-hand combat. The average life expectancy for a new soldier in the city was 24 hours. For months, the Sixth Army bled. They captured 90% of the city, but they could not take the last narrow strip along the Volga River. General Paulus, exhausted, pleaded with Hitler to let him withdraw, to wait for winter to pass. Hitler refused. "Victory or death," was the message from Berlin. And then the trap sprung. While the Germans were fixated on the city, the Soviet General Zhukov had been massing an enormous new army on the flanks. In November 1942, in the middle of a blizzard, Operation Uranus launched. The Red Army smashed through the weak Romanian and Italian armies guarding the Sixth Army's rear, and in 72 hours they met. The Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. Hitler promised to supply them from the air. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe couldn't come close. The men inside the Kessel, or cauldron, began to starve. They ate their horses, then rats, then nothing. Frostbitten, skeletal, and out of ammunition, they held out. On January 31st, 1943, General Paulus, whom Hitler had just promoted to Field Marshal, a reminder that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, gave up. Of the 250,000 men trapped, only 91,000 survived to surrender. Of those, only 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Back home, the propaganda ministry announced 3 days of national mourning. For the first time, the German people understood. The war was not just going badly. The war was being lost. The disaster at Stalingrad was a psychological earthquake. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility was shattered. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels understood that the old narrative of glorious victory was dead. He needed a new one. In February 1943, he stood before a carefully selected audience in Berlin and delivered his most famous speech.
He asked the crowd a series of questions, culminating in one. "Do you want total war?" The crowd roared, "Yes!" Total war was a promise of national survival. It meant every part of German society would be mobilized. Women, who the regime had previously pushed into the home, were now pulled into factories. Theaters were closed, non-essential businesses were shuttered. The man put in charge of this was Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, now the armaments minister. And Speer worked a miracle. Despite the setbacks, and despite the beginning of a massive Allied bombing campaign, German war production increased. In 1944, Germany produced more tanks and planes than ever before. How? The answer was dark. This miracle was built on the backs of millions of Zwangsarbeiters, slave laborers. Prisoners of war and civilians rounded up from occupied territories worked to death in German factories. While Speer built weapons, the German people were now looking to the skies in terror. The British were bombing by night, the Americans by day. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin were reduced to infernos, firestorms that melted asphalt and suffocated tens of thousands in their basement shelters. The war was no longer something happening over there. It was here. And then the news that German command had been dreading for years finally came. On June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Atlantic Wall, the massive fortification system that propaganda had promised was impenetrable, was breached in a single morning. The Wehrmacht was now trapped in the one scenario its generals had feared since 1914, a true two-front war. In the West, they were being pushed back by a tide of American and British steel. In the East, the Red Army had launched Operation Bagration, an offensive so massive it made D-Day look like a sideshow. It utterly annihilated Army Group Center, the core of the German army in the East. The war was no longer about victory. It was about delaying the inevitable. And inside Germany, a small group of officers decided there was only one way out. The Führer himself had to die.
The July 20th plot of 1944 was a last desperate act. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's bomb, planted in Hitler's headquarters, exploded, but it failed to kill him. The consequences were horrific. Hitler, now consumed by paranoia, unleashed a wave of arrests and executions. The regime and the war would continue to its bitter, grinding end. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a ruin. The Wehrmacht, once the terror of the world, was a broken remnant. In the West, the Allies had crossed the Rhine, but in the East, the true terror, from the German perspective, was approaching: the Red Army. Fueled by a desire for vengeance for the 27 million Soviets who had died, the Red Army crossed the German border and unleashed a wave of retribution. The propaganda that had once painted them as subhuman now worked in reverse. German civilians, terrified, fled west in a massive, panicked exodus. The final battle would be for Berlin. Hitler, in his bunker beneath the ruins of the Chancellery, had decided the city would be his funeral pyre. The defense of the capital was a phantom. It consisted of the Volkssturm, the People Storm. Old men, some veterans of the First World War, and children as young as 12 from the Hitler Youth. They were given bicycles, cheap Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and orders to fight to the last man. It was a grotesque, suicidal fantasy. The Soviet army, led by Marshal Zhukov, surrounded the city and began to shell it into oblivion. The Battle of Berlin was not a battle, it was an execution. It was Stalingrad in reverse, a brutal street-by-street annihilation. In the bunker, the Nazi leadership disintegrated. With the roar of Soviet artillery shaking the concrete walls, Hitler dictated his last will, married his mistress Eva Braun, and then, on April 30th, 1945, they committed suicide. Above ground, the city fell. Soviet soldiers, in a symbolic act of victory, raised the red banner over the blackened, smoking ruins of the Reichstag. The war in Europe was over,
But for the German people and for the millions of German soldiers, the ordeal was not. A new, uncertain horror was just beginning. The hour zero. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. For Germany, it was the Stunde Null, 0 hour. The nation ceased to exist. The cities were rubble. The government was gone, and 11 million German soldiers were now prisoners of war. Their fate, their entire future, would be decided by a simple question: who had captured them? For the millions who surrendered to the Americans, British, and French, the journey was one of humiliation but relative safety. They were held in massive open-air camps, sometimes starving, but they were protected by the Geneva Convention. They were subjected to denazification, forced to watch films of the concentration camps they claimed they knew nothing about. This was the birth of a powerful, lasting myth, the clean Wehrmacht. The idea that the regular German army had fought an honorable, chivalrous war, and that all the atrocities, the Holocaust, the massacres, were the work of the SS. It was a comforting lie that allowed a new Germany to be built, and that allowed former soldiers to re-enter society. Many of those would ironically be rearmed just a few years later to serve in a new German army, the Bundeswehr, to face a new enemy, the Soviets. But for the 3 million German soldiers captured by the Red Army, there was no Geneva Convention. There was only vengeance. These men were not seen as soldiers. They were seen as fascists who had helped murder 27 million people. They were marched into the Soviet Gulag. Their re-education was not in a classroom. It was hard labor, rebuilding the cities they had destroyed, working in mines, logging, in the Siberian forests. The conditions were brutal. Hundreds of thousands died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion long after the war had ended. The last of these prisoners would not be sent home until 1956, more than a decade after the surrender. The war had begun with the promise of a 1,000-year Reich. It ended with 2 Germanys, 2 fates, and a legacy of guilt and ruin that would echo for generations. The story of the German soldier, which began with the thunder of the Blitzkrieg, ended not in a heroic last stand, but in the silence of a prison camp, forced to reckon with the ruins of a world they and their Führer had created.